functions of the office of President during my absence. As the Honourable the Senate will not be meeting prior to my departure, it will not be possible for the usual formal message to be sent to your chamber. Will you, therefore, please bring my absence formally to the attention of the Honourable the Senate when next it meets? Signed, Her Excellency the President at State House.
Announcement by Your Honour.
Minutes of our meeting, February 3rd, 2024, for deferral. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'd like to move that the minutes of the meeting held on Friday, May 3rd, 2024, be deferred at this time.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Friday, May 3rd, be deferred. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Thanks, the ayes have it. Those minutes are accordingly deferred. I received excuses for absence from Senator Most Honourable Jerome Walcott, Senator Crystal Drakes, and Senator Monique Tate. An indication of late arrival from Senator the Honourable Lyndall Nurse. I want to acknowledge some visitors this morning, especially our dear colleague, former Senator Dr. Christina Hines. Very happy to have you. We spoke kindly about you in your absence. We're very happy to have your presence and hope that you will enjoy being with us on this occasion. I also want to recognize the presence of the Ms. Louise Award, the Commissioner of the Barbados Revenue Authority and her staff, and special guest of Her Honor the Deputy Speaker, Deputy President. Let me just pull those details up with the help of modern technology. Mr. Andrew Herwood, a Barbadian who resides in the United States, holds the rank of Brigadier General and is Director of Strategy Plans, Policy and Resources in the United States Army. And as a special touch to perhaps bring the balance to bring some balance on things, let's put it that way. He's also an ordained minister. So, General, I'm not sure which hat you're wearing today, the hat of war or the hat of peace. But whichever you're wearing, we're very, very happy to have you here today. Welcome home. So welcome all of you.
Petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The person Standing Order 45-2 is suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the first reading, beg to move the first reading of the following bills. The first reading of the Notary Public's Bill 2024. I beg also to move the first reading of the Corporation Tax Top-Up Tax Bill 2024 and the Income Tax Amendment Bill 2024.
The question is that the Notaries Public Bill 2024 the Income Tax Amendment Bill 2024 and the Corporation Top-Up Tax Bill 2024 be read a first time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those bills are accordingly read a first time. Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 4, sir. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Corporation Top-Up Tax Bill 2024.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg your leave to treat to items number 4 and 5 on the order paper as a cognate debate.
The question is that the debate on items number 4 and 5, that is the Corporation Top-Up Tax Bill and the Income Tax Amendment Bill, be treated as a cognate debate. Just for clarity, they will be voted on separately, but we'll take the second reading contributions in one debate, if this Senate is so agreed. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Accordingly, we will treat items on the order paper 4 and 5 as one debate during a second reading. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, the Senate is assembled today to debate 2 bills. I will call them at the beginning of my presentation before I get into the weeds of the presentation itself. Mr. President, we are dealing with, in the first instance, the Corporation Tax Top-Up Tax Bill. And as a consequence, there are a number of amendments that are going to be made to the Income Tax Amendment Bill. These, Mr. President, are 2 items that are the subject of significant tax reform overall and the government's tax policy overall, and so they fall rightly within the remit of the Barbados Revenue Authority as a tax collecting agency, and I want to recognize, as you have done already, the presence of the officials from the Barbados Revenue Authority. I have to commend the Revenue Commissioner, because when I called and I said we would want to make sure that we have representatives of BRA present for the Senate debate, she'd indicated that she would have representatives of her team. But as all good leaders do, she did not just send them, she came herself with them. And I want to commend the Barbados Revenue Authority for their presence here today. We have worked certainly from my own ministry, in the Ministry of Energy and Business. Typically, a lot of times people talk about the energy section of the ministry without recognizing that ensconced within the ministry's bosom is also an entity that was known once upon a time as International Business Unit, and it does cover the international business agenda. And so together with the Ministry of Finance, the Barbados Revenue Authority, also the various agencies, including the Central Bank and the Attorney General's Office on the AML side, anti-money laundering side, and you, Mr. Chairman, would know perhaps far more than I do on the matters relating to anti-money laundering and the Financial Action Task Force. These agencies together constitute the agencies that have been working on the government's business sector, or taxes as they relate to the conduct of business in Barbados, and Invest Barbados as it relates to the attractiveness of Barbados as a jurisdiction overall. And I want to commend them for having steered us through very turbulent waters, not just now, but over the course of time. Mr. President, when I was first appointed to the Senate in May of 2018, I believe by the end of that year, May 2018 was the start, December 2018, just before Christmas, we had a landmark session in this honorable chamber where we held the longest session that I could recall in the last 6 years or so of the Senate. And it was on matters relating to international business. It was on matters relating to the work of the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the European Union, and how the commitments made previously by a previous minister with responsibility for international business then affected this government. And we had to pass, I believe it was 13 pieces of legislation in one night. and one sitting of the Senate, and we worked well through the day and into the night to be able to complete that work. Over the intervening period, Mr. President, you have heard me in this honorable chamber, and you have heard my predecessors in the other place speak on a range of actions that have been taken subsequent to that December 2018. We have seen, Mr. President, most recently, I believe I would have brought an amendment on the Economic Substance Act last year, instantly, also in December of 2022, we made changes to the ESA, and we are now in the process, Mr. President, of making further changes as a broad umbrella body of work on tax reform overall. In my own ministry, the Cabinet has agreed to changes in the foreign currency permit regime. Those matters are currently before the Chief Parliamentary Council for drafting, and they will come up for revision, but those things may not even get this far, Mr. President, because they may have been overtaken by events. And so, Mr. President, I think the point that I'm trying to make as I start this debate is that time, external circumstances, international organizations, bilateral partners as well, and I will speak about that in time to come, and our development partners in particular in the OECD and our bilateral partners in the European Union, specifically the European Commission, have a significant role to play in working together with jurisdictions like Barbados. Let me start also by saying, Mr. President, that there was a time when the term international business now evolved into global business, and now all business is local, Mr. President, when those things were seen in a negative light, and Barbados was branded, regrettably, as a tax haven, as an offshore tax haven. Barbados and many countries like ourselves, certainly under the former Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Owen Nafa, would have built up what was then the financial services industry. You, Mr. President, would have had the privilege of leading and anchoring Barbados's work through that process. And so we have done over many incarnations and across many governments. Each incarnation has seen us both trying to position Barbados with a competitive edge on the one hand, while simultaneously responding to the global rules that are evolving on matters relating to tax and relating to business, how businesses function, in particular, businesses functioning on a cross-border basis. And this amendment today, I'm going to start with the corporation top-up tax amendment in the initial instance, and then I will move on to how it then results in consequential amendments to the Income Tax Act. This amendment today, Mr. President, was first announced to the country by the Honorable Prime Minister in 2023, at the end of 2023, with an indication that effective January 2024, Barbados would have a new corporation tax regime. And the Honorable Prime Minister at that time outlined the why. The Honorable Prime Minister at that time also went into great detail about what the implications would be for Barbados and the work that still needed to be done. I also, Mr. President, along with the team that I referred to earlier, have had the opportunity to work directly with the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development themselves. I believe my first overseas mission when I first joined the Ministry of Energy and Business was actually not for energy, but it was to the OECD in the November, and I joined the ministry in the October. And I had to go off to the OECD very quickly to be able to represent Barbados's interests in that forum. We were going at the time to the FHTP, and they in turn were preparing to report to the EU Code of Conduct on Barbados's performance in a number of areas, specifically related to the exchange of information and the automatic exchange of information, which is undertaken by the International Business Unit in collaboration with the Barbados Revenue Authority, who does the automatic exchange under the treaty that we have signed for mutual exchange. So, Mr. President.
Senator Cummins, just for the benefit of Hansard and posterity, you may want to explain some of the acronyms from time to time, at least initially, so that the Hansard reporters can get a better handle of what these acronyms are about.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think I had outlined the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and I needed to do so for the FHTP. FHTP is a forum on harmful tax practices, and I did speak about the automatic exchange of information as I go through AEIO, AEIO, automatic exchange of information, and so I will make every effort to ensure that I am using the full title and not the acronyms. So, Mr. President, the global environment in which we operated, or we are operating, required that my very first mission was to the OECD to deal with Barbados' compliance to the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices. And we had a range of measures that Barbados needed to look at to ensure that we were compliant with the global tax rules that had been determined by the OECD. Barbados at the time had gotten in a number of areas, because each area is assessed differently and separately. You have compliant, which means that you have met all of the requirements that have been set down in the global tax requirements, and that's the highest rating. You could get a largely compliant rating, which would suggest that you have done the majority of things that needed to be done, but that there were some areas that still needed some work. And then the third area was partially compliant, where you still had some significant work to be done. Barbados is not among those countries that fell in any category below partially compliant, so I wouldn't go into it. But the lowest ranking that we got in 2022 was partially compliant. We undertook at that time, under the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, to negotiate with the OECD a technical cooperation partnership, which is in effect now. The OECD at that time was able to work together with the International Business Unit, I will call it thereafter the business unit in the ministry, to identify those areas where we were largely compliant, but not fully compliant, partially compliant, in order for us to put measures in place on multiple tracks to be able to reach that fully compliant ranking. And that work is underway as we speak to ensure that Barbados is not just making its boast that it is not in offshore tax haven, but that we are not only compliant with global rules, but that we are an active participant in the process of determining what our reviews would look like. Moreover, Mr. President, we have also been involved in the inclusive framework of the OECD, which seeks to address some of the concerns by countries like ours that rules are being made by parties outside of ourselves without our participation, and we have ensured that Barbados has had a seat at that table. That continues to be the case, Mr. President. Barbados continues to actively engage with the organs of the OECD, specifically through the FHTP, the inclusive framework, and there are a number of other mechanisms where I believe the Revenue Commissioner herself sits on various committees, specifically working on various issues. We then undertook, Mr. President, also under my ministry, to contract an advisor to work with our agencies on the process of reform. That advisor, who has addressed the country on more than one occasion and who has been working with the business community, so I can say their name publicly, Mr. Pascal Santama, who was the former head of tax at the OECD, has come on board as advisor to the Prime Minister and therefore has been available to the entire team to work through much of the work that has been presented so far and what I will be presenting to the Honorable Senate today. Mr. President, we then, over the course of the last few months, the Minister and the Ministry of Finance, together with the team from the BRA and the Prime Minister's office, have been actively working with the OECD on these matters to ensure that Barbados not just protects the jurisdiction, but that we are in every other way, as we are in every other sector, a first mover to protect the jurisdiction. So what are we dealing with, Mr. President? In 2021, the OECD, they started the work on the inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting. We call it the BEPS. They then looked, Mr. President, at the time by October, on introducing what is now known globally as the two-pillar solution. The two-pillar solution, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 2, in particular, looked at reallocating some of the profits and in-turn taxes from where economic activities were conducted to where the markets, which is the customers in this instance, where they were located. Now, I pause here only to say, Mr. President, that one of the things that Barbados has been very clear about historically is that we are not an offshore tax haven for several reasons. We are a low tax jurisdiction or nominal tax jurisdiction. We were at least before we had the corporation tax changes that I'm proposing here for the Honourable Senate to discuss. But Mr. President, we've also prioritized economic substance. And we have focused on ensuring that business of substance will be attracted to Barbados. Not shell companies, as is the case in other jurisdictions. Barbados is not some of the other jurisdictions that you typically hear about when you talk about offshore, the offshore business, or you hear about international business, or you hear about tax havens. That is not Barbados. That has never been and will not now be the Barbados brand. Instead, Mr. President, Barbados has focused heavily on ensuring that we are a jurisdiction of substance. So Pillar 1 in the first instance applies to multinational enterprises, MNEs, who have a global turnover of above 20 billion euros and profitability of above 10% before their tax or before their revenue. Pillar 2, which is what will constitute the nature of the debate today, Mr. President, speaks about the introduction of a minimum effective tax rate. Keep that in mind, Mr. President, because that will come up repeatedly through my presentation. A minimum effective tax rate of 15% for multinational enterprises, MNE groups, with revenue in excess of 750 million euros or 850 million USD per their consolidated financial statements via the Globe rules. We call it the Globe rules. They're called the Global Anti-Base Erosion Model rules, and it includes what we call an STR rule, which is a subject to tax rule, which allows a jurisdiction to impose additional tax of up to 9% on certain intergroup payments. Now, Mr. President, the key here is this. What this has allowed under the BEPS 2.0 framework is for there to be a shifting in the way in which international taxation is undertaken. The framework that I have just outlined, Mr. President, in particular in Pillar 2, has significantly impacted the way in which the tax structure is functioning, and it introduces for the first time a global minimum tax. It introduces, Mr. President, a global minimum tax. And what does that mean? It means that one jurisdiction in some place, some part of the world, may have a tax rate of 2%. Another jurisdiction, like the United States, may have a tax rate of 9% here, 15% there. The UK may have a tax rate of 22% or something else. And a jurisdiction like Barbados may have had an effective tax rate of 5%. We now, Mr. President, are functioning in an environment where the global minimum tax effectively seeks to ensure that there are two main rules. One, the global anti-base erosion rules, which is the global rules, and the subject to tax rules, the STR. What this means, Mr. President, is that every jurisdiction will now apply the global minimum tax of 15%. And if a jurisdiction falls, I'm trying to simplify this, if a jurisdiction falls below the 15%, then an applicable, what we call top-up tax, then is levied. And what does that mean, Mr. President? It means that in the first instance, if Barbados, and we have seen some jurisdictions do it, you have the minimum tax, 15%. Barbados may decide, as we have, and as is proposed, to have a tax rate of 9%. Companies will have the option, Mr. President, of determining where they will pay that 15%. And that's where the rub comes, Mr. President. What compels a company to decide to stay in Barbados where they are already domiciled and to pay the tax in Barbados rather than moving their headquarters to a different jurisdiction and choosing to have their tax authorities and not Mrs. Louisa Ward's BRA collect the revenue in that jurisdiction? That's really what we're dealing with here. Why Barbados? And I think we have to always bear this in mind as we consider some of the positions that we take. If we make Barbados a hostile jurisdiction for investment, it comes back to haunt us in ways that we will not want to see. If we make Barbados a place where it seems as though this is not the place to put your money or your business because there is a wrangling of some kind that is hostile to business, you will have consequences that are well beyond any immediate benefits that you perceive. Why would a company then choose to remain in Barbados as a domicile, to be able to pay tax, whether at 2%, 5%, or 15%, or anything in between, as opposed to another jurisdiction? And let me connect this to what we as a country are used to. And Senator Drake, Mr. President, is not here today, but she has spoken on previous occasions in economic debates, and I want to use her words in this context. She used the lifestyle and the standard of living to which we are accustomed. Mr. President, a government does not trade. A government does not do business. A government collects taxes which are counted as revenue, which in a country like Barbados goes to finance an extensive development agenda that benefits people. Barbados, Mr. President, is one of the countries in the world, one of the only countries in the world, where I can walk into a healthcare institution anywhere and get health care. Senator Maynard. On Saturday, my Rotary Club, Mr. President, had a health fair in Golden Square. And I was there with my fellow Rotarians. And a young woman who was there said to me, you know, Lisa, I don't know when my bonuses is gonna get taxed, you know. I used to be real vexed whenever I see my bonus get taxed and I see my pay slip and that money comes out. Before I could answer, Mr. President, I was the representative of government there, but someone who was not answered before I could speak. And that person said this, my son got sick last year. My son had to be rushed to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. They had to have 2 major surgeries, and they stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. When I was there, I kept asking, I gotta pay for this? What's gonna happen here? The only thing they said they had to pull their pocket for was something to do with breathing that the hospital at the time did not have in stock, and they had to go to the place Collins up in Warrens to get it and then bring it back. But everything else that was provided for a 2-week stay in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, plus the surgeries, plus the recovery period, every meal was paid for by the government. And this person said to me, not to me, to the person who was asking the question, it was only in that moment, and I've lived in Barbados, I'm almost 50 years old. They said it was only in that moment that I realized just how personal to me my taxes are, because I was able to have the benefit of my son being cared for. And I stood there, and I said, you get it, because that speaks to the quality of life and the standard of living to which Senator Drake spoke in this honorable chamber before. The things to which we have become accustomed. Education at source without having to pass a penny. We were looking at each other, the same person who spoke, and we said, boy, you know, we went to university at UWI overseas. And the only thing our parents had to pay for was our accommodation. We didn't have to pay for tuition. The government paid for that. And the list could go on. Yesterday, or the day before, I went to put air in my tires, and the guy at the tire shop quarreled with me. He said, but you could put some air in your tires more regular, though. Why are you doing that? I said, but sometimes the roads are bad, especially when you live in the country and you got potholes and you're dropping in. And you know what he said to me, Mr. President? He said, but the road's looking good these days, though, so you ain't got as many potholes driving home as you used to. All of those are the things that government's collection of taxes go to. There's no fairy. There's no leprechaun with a pot of gold at the bottom of a rainbow when the rainfall, especially during hurricane season, that the government dips into to pay for your child's health care in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital or your surgeries. There is no pot of gold that the government dips into to pay the University of the West Indies so our children could get a tertiary level education. There's no pot of gold that the government repairs secondary schools and primary schools over the summer holidays that we have coming up now to be able to make sure we can conduct summer camps. all of the things that we consider entitlements as part of our citizenry, our citizenship, have to be paid for, Mr. President, by taxes. And government's ability to collect taxes have a direct correlation to our standard of living and our quality of life. We won't have everything that we want, Mr. President. It's not a realistic thing. It's not a utopia. We won't always be able to do things in a timely manner, but that we will commit to doing them as soon as funds become available, given the vagaries of international relationships and international economic relationships. We as a government have demonstrated by our actions, not by our words, by our actions, that we are committed to improving healthcare in Queen Elizabeth Hospital, by the investments that we have seen there, that we are committed to ensuring that Barbadians can go to schools. We have seen those investments. By ensuring that Barbadians are able to drive on roads that are fit for purpose and not master park cars, that is something that we can see. Will we have all of the money to do it all at once? No, no one ever does. But that it will be done incrementally, and as funds become available, that is a commitment of a government. And international tax and our commitment to ensuring that companies that are already domiciled in Barbados maintain that domicile in Barbados and pay those taxes at 9 or 15% here in Barbados is what this government is ensuring with the reforms that we are undertaking. Because we understand that the payment of taxes and the collection of government revenue is directly correlated to government's expenditure on people and on development. That is what we do, and this is who we are as the government. So, Mr. President, let me put some numbers in here. $470 million would have been collected, I believe it was last year, from corporation taxes. Of that $470 million, Mr. President, $400 million came from companies that are registered initially overseas, international companies, and are chosen to domicile here. 400 million of $470 million. That ain't nothing to sniff at. Nothing at all, Mr. President. That $400 million, Mr. President, could go towards, if we were to go back to our estimates of expenditure, which we negotiated, which we debated in this honorable chamber just a few months ago, Mr. President, we could see just how $400 million could go. How far $400 million could go, Mr. President. And so it is the government's commitment to ensure that we are able to, one, retain business in the country, as well as to attract new business in the country. So here's what the rules will allow for us to do. In our case, Mr. President, we have seen that the Honorable Prime Minister has announced a tax rate effective January 1 at 9%. That 9%, Mr. President, is below the maximum of 15%. And what that means, Mr. President, is that the top-up tax will then kick in. I'm keeping it very simple and not trying to be as technical as this may require sometimes in a different forum. But in this room, in this chamber, Mr. President, I'm trying to keep it simple. It means that the difference between the 9 and the 15% of tax, Mr. President, companies will make a determination, will have to pay that in the country where they are originally from. So what does that look like, Mr. President? What are we talking about? Currently, Barbados has a number of companies that are in scope, and I don't want there to be any mischief around who this applies to, because that's something that I know some may run with. This does not apply, Mr. President, to companies that you just go down the road and set up and you are selling widgets to another company across the way. Unless, Mr. President, you are considered to be what we call in scope. In scope meaning that you fall within the threshold. If you are turning over above, note my language, above, over, more than 750 million euros or 850 million US dollars, you are not in scope for this amendment. It does not apply. This applies in our context to the largest of the large. And so this is, excuse me, where the global tax will apply. I want to show you, Mr. President, and take you through how the top-up tax, in particular, that difference between 9 and 15 is applied. In the first instance, they're what we call constituent entities, and the constituent entities that fall within scope, you usually have in the case of an MNE, multinational entity, they usually will determine if they are in scope. Once they have done so, they will identify the constituent entities that fall within the group, where they are located, and then the above $750 million will apply. In the case of Barbados, Mr. President, I want to just put the number in Barbados dollars. I've already said 750 million euros, 850 million USD. In the case of Barbados, it is 1.59 billion with a B dollars, based on the 4 fiscal years immediately preceding the tested fiscal year. Then we have to determine what the globe income would be for each constituent entity, and they will cover a range of things in there that I won't go through. Then you have to cover the third step to determine the covered taxes, what taxes are covered, which will be the income paid by the constituent entity in Barbados. And then you move to the fourth step to help you to calculate the effective tax rate. And then finally, the effective tax rate also of the constituent entities of the MNE. And then the final step, Mr. President, will be to calculate the top-up tax. And the top-up tax, as I've said, is where the effective tax rate falls below what the 15% is in any jurisdiction who is now calculating the top-up tax. So if, for example, Mr. President, you have an entity that has a location in Barbados, Barbados is paying 9%, and their parent, ultimate beneficial owner, is located in the UK, they will pay the difference between the 9 and the 15% to the United Kingdom Tax Administration and the 9% to the Barbados government and through the Barbados Revenue Authority. So, Mr. President, those are the basic principles of the regulations that we have been seeing. And as a consequence, Mr. President, this has direct implications for how we administer business in Barbados. Now, I want to get into some specifics in Barbados so you understand how many entities we're dealing with. Barbados has a total of approximately 185 MNE groups with subsidiaries located in a range of jurisdictions ranging from Canada, China, the European Union, Latin America, the UK, the US, and other countries. You also have some right here in the Caribbean region, but that number is quite small. So, Mr. President, you will have 185 companies within scope who will be applying these rules as I have outlined. Now, I want to go back, before I come forward, I want to go back into the question of concessions first, and what Barbados' previous regime looked like and what it will now have to be considering. Previously, Barbados would have had a regime that looked at things like tax holidays, concessionary tax rates, low tax, and so on. Many of those now constitute the overall tax reform package that is being led by the BRA and the Ministry of Finance, and they will at times speak about what has to be done there. But you also have already seen from the Ministry of Finance several several reforms that are underway that speak to concessions and tax holidays and so on. Now, obviously, there is the expectation, Mr. President, that if we are moving from a 5% effective tax rate to a 9% effective tax rate, that the tax take by the government will increase. There is the expectation. However, Mr. President, I want to caution that it does not mean that the government is running away with a new pot of money that it did not have before. Because businesses still have to make their decisions. Businesses still have to determine, we can pay this tax in Barbados for 15% because we like it here, because the country is peaceful, it has a stable political climate, my children are already going to school here, we're comfortable, we're happy, we like what Barbados is doing as a country, we want to contribute to the development trajectory. I choose to pay the tax at 9% in Barbados rather than paying it at any rate anywhere else, 15%, and my country will get, another country will get the top up. We have the option, they have the option of making those decisions for themselves. And we expect, Mr. President, that in the medium term, as companies make those decisions internally, that we will see what the business landscape looks like. there will be some companies that will decide to stay. There will be some companies that will decide that they prefer to remain in Barbados. But as they continue internally to consolidate their operations and to treat to what is happening within the Pillar 2 evolution and what other countries are going to do, we will have to wait and see what their determinations are. And that is in particular in the case of countries like the US and like Canada, who have not yet made some key decisions that are still being awaited. We'll have to wait to see where they go, Mr. President. But what we do know is that in the event that these companies make the decision to favor Barbados and to remain in the jurisdiction, that Barbados would have an expectation of a tax increase, which would allow Barbados to even expand further on what this government has commenced doing with little post-pandemic, post-storm, increased expenditure, even with reduced revenue, that if there is a further increase in revenue, that the government will do more to support people. So I want, Mr. President, then to bring this home to speak specifically about some of the changes that are being contemplated in the legislation and why. We had a couple of options, Mr. President. We did. We had about 6 different considerations that the team undertook. The team undertook to look at us possibly doing nothing, waiting until everything was settled and every country had indicated, and we knew where all the overseas jurisdictions were going, we could do nothing. But that had a high price, and the difficulties with taking that position were perhaps too numerous to mention. We could not go that direction. We then had to go to look at option 2. Option 2 would have been where we introduced, much as is already in place in the United States, a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax based on the mechanics, and then we would have to implement that. We could, as option 3, evaluate and reform the tax incentives to be in line with the global minimum tax. We've already seen that's what's happening. Implement the core global minimum tax rules. And then we also had the option, Mr. President, of making a series of additional changes that would have been ancillary. But core to the decision-making, we needed to make the determination to implement the global minimum tax rules. Now, I've spoken, Mr. President, at great length about the Pillar 2 provisions. I've spoken about Barbados as a jurisdiction. I've spoken about the OECD, and I've spoken about what countries are doing. But, Mr. President, I want to take a moment to divert just very slightly. Now, when I started this presentation this morning, Mr. President, I spoke about how in 2018, some of us in here would recall, I believe Senator Maynard, Senator Boyce, and Senator Haynes would recall in particular that December 2018 marathon session of the Senate dealing with these provisions, in particular relating to the OECD and the EU. Mr. President, we also would remember, many of us, especially those people who function in the international business space and work with CTSPs, corporate trust service providers, you would understand how many of these instances we have had to navigate where we have prepared for with the BRA, automatic exchange of information submissions to the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, making sure that we have covered substantially all of the entities that fall within scope, making sure that we are providing reports to the FHTP that would then go on to the EU Code of Conduct group that would then in turn make determinations on whether Barbados remains on or off somebody's gray or blacklist as an institution. We have navigated, Mr. President, the FHTP and even the FHTP and the FATF, Forum on Anti-Money Laundering. I can't remember the last one, the other acronym is, that's under the AG's office, not my ministry. So I get to forget maybe. But FATF and the anti-money laundering work. Mr. President, we have seen that we could work like slaves. We could work through the night. Mr. President, I remember when we did the Economic Substance Amendment and when we had the last submission to the FHTP last year, January, February, December through February. Mr. President, I had just landed in the country. I came back from somewhere. I don't even remember where. And the Revenue Commissioner lit up my life with a SOS call, and we had to move into action, Mr. President. It was a Sunday night, I had just come back. I think I was coming back from the Gulf. I was exhausted and jet lagged, and I did not have the opportunity to go home that night. We then had to go into Baobab Towers that night. We all assembled that Sunday evening around 7. All of the officers of the IBU came out that night, administrative, technical, you name it. They assembled that night, and we worked through the night until about 5 o'clock the next morning to make sure we could make the submissions to the Barbados Revenue Authority. 5 o'clock the next morning came and found us there. The Prime Minister herself, around 11 o'clock the night, came and joined us and brought coffee around 11 o'clock for us to be able to sustain working through the night. There were corporate trust service providers who received calls from us at 1 o'clock in the morning because there was information that was outstanding. And without fail, every entity responded and provided the information we needed to make sure Barbados was not on anybody's gray or blacklist because we were non-compliant. That team that I have the absolute privilege to lead, along with the team led by the Revenue Commissioner, worked slavishly to protect Barbados's brand and to protect Barbados's reputation. And we met the targets, and we did not find ourselves in that incarnation on an EU blacklist for harmful tax practices. But then you know what happened, Mr. President? You know what happened? A small jurisdiction like ours, with limited capacity like ours, spent the kind of time that I have just described and put the kind of resources that I have just described, including a portal with a schema and all kinds of stuff that we worked together with the BRA to develop as a technology platform to allow for the easy uploading of data so that they could clean and scrub the data and then send it off to the OECD FHTP. You know what happened, Mr. President? We met the FHTP requirements. There was a favorable reputation for this country to the EU Code of Conduct group, Mr. President. But by the time the EU Code of Conduct group met and gave Barbados a recommendation for a favorable outcome to the EU Commission, you then had individual member countries who opted because Barbados, despite meeting all the technical requirements, despite the regulatory reforms being in place, despite the reporting obligations having been met, despite Barbados submitting for automatic exchange of information to all countries where they had opted into the convention, despite Barbados doing all of that, Mr. President, an individual member state or individual member states still opted to blacklist Barbados for no other reason other than the fact that it had a lower tax rate than them. Nothing else, Mr. President. We were not a tax haven. We were not non-compliant. And in fact, the mechanisms created by the OECD themselves, with whom we have worked extremely closely, and I want to commend in this moment, Mr. President, the OECD, the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, and the Global Forum of the OECD for maintaining Barbados's confidence and for working closely with my team. I can pick up my phone, Mr. President, at any time and call the leadership of the OECD Global Forum and they respond. I am confident that the same applies to the Revenue Commissioner and now to the Minister and the Ministry of Finance. Without hesitation, last week they were here. Regrettably, I was off island when they first started their sessions, so I was not able to meet with them. But Mr. President, the head of the OECD Global Forum and the Revenue Commissioner knows that this is true because they were having dinner with the Revenue Commissioner and I was not able to make that session. But they messaged and they said, we want to see you. We can't leave Barbados without meeting. And so before I went to Cabinet last Thursday, I took the time and the Revenue Commissioner was messaging me. And I said, well, I'm with them now as we speak. And she said, awesome. Because, Mr. President, we have built a relationship with an entity that historically we saw as an antagonizer to us. We've built that relationship. And so now we have, as I mentioned before, a technical assistance program with the OECD. We have an advisor who is a former head of tax from the OECD. We have his successor, Manal Korwan, who is incredible as well, a representative of the United States working at the OECD. We are also building a relationship with them, and we've met with them last year in Lisbon in the last Global Forum meeting in November of last year. And we continue to make sure that through the relationships, even last week, the Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance would have just come back from meetings in OECD headquarters with their leadership, because relationships matter, Mr. President. And so for us, it is a concern as a jurisdiction that even with the relationship between us and the OECD and the organs of the OECD being at an all-time high, and we are still seeing, despite that, individual member states making unilateral calls to blacklist Barbados. It is most unfortunate. And it is for that reason, Mr. President, that there has been a move by countries out of the African continent to contemplate what happens in a genuine multilateral forum of the United Nations in this instance, and there has been a call for the work of the OECD to be taken up by a genuinely multilateral agency to which all countries are members, because as we know, we're not all members of the OECD, but they have created organs which allow us to participate actively and to take leadership in those agencies. But within the United Nations, there is a call led by the African countries, in particular countries like Nigeria, for there to be a UN multilateral approach to tax matters to address some of these challenges. And so, Mr. President, these kinds of engagements on tax, minimum tax regimes, Pillar 1, Pillar 2, the GMDTT, all of those things, the Globe Rules, these are the things that are occupying the international community's attention. These are the things that help to or hinder local business. And these are the things that occupy the attention of our ministries, in particular, the ministries that I have spoken about before. And so where is Barbados now? Barbados has made the determination, as you will see in the corporation tax draft legislation, to be able to have a comprehensive reform of our corporation tax regime that allows us to accomplish many of the things to which I have spoken about. It covers in part 2, Mr. President, which is where I will start, the imposition of the top-up tax. I have outlined what the top-up tax is and the scope of that top-up tax. Remember, I did say the 9 to the 15 difference, and for the small business sector, which I also represent, the effective rate would be at the 5%, Mr. President, for registered small businesses. The location of an entity, that is important in the calculation of the effective tax rate, as well as the MNEs and the constituent entities within it, and the currency conversion. In part 3, it looks at the computation of the qualifying income or loss, that is for the company itself. I do want to point out here, as in clause 20, that there is an exemption which is captured in the rules for international shipping. This is excluded from the application of these rules, Mr. President, globally, as well as here in Barbados. Mr. President, then in part 4, it speaks about the adjusted covered taxes. This is in the computation that I mentioned, as well as the effective tax rate and the top-up tax. It speaks about the special rules for corporate restructuring and holding structures. We are a jurisdiction, as I mentioned, of economic substance. And then it covers in part 7 through 8, tax neutrality and distribution regimes, including the ultimate parent entity and the flow-through entity. When I spoke earlier about the ultimate beneficial owner and the ultimate parent company, as well as the constituent entities, this is the legal definition of what I was referring to. And then the administrative procedures and enforcement that you have here, as well as transitional relief. Now, the transitional relief, the Honorable Minister in the other place spoke about what is applicable as transitional relief for this financial year only, and then the transitional safe harbor, and then finally you have miscellaneous provisions, Mr. President. Now, the provisions to which I have just referred and the sections in order number 4 that I have just made reference to have consequential implications on the Income Tax Act, which is either order number 5 item number 5 on the order paper. And so you will see, Mr. President, a number of amendments being made, therefore, to the Income Tax Act, and you have those things relating to, of course, I want to speak about this section here under Division JA, calculation of assessable income from qualifying intellectual property. Mr. President, one of the things that we have been able to put into this legislation and part of the overall regime has been what we call, we don't want to call it cash boxes, but looking at IP and you treating to IP as a source of attraction of business. And I want to take the opportunity here also to say that under the Business Barbados entity, which my ministry is also responsible for establishing, that there is an entity within it that will subsume the intellectual property work, which used to be the IP unit. And so now we are pleased to advise that we are working with the World Intellectual Property Organization and the regional partner as a consultant to be able to build out a brand new intellectual property agency that looks at a range of matters, including the provisions for intellectual property that are captured within this legislation and our overall tax reform. Mr. President, we also are making some amendments that allow for us, beyond IP, to make changes to the calculation of the way in which taxes are computed. You have that, as well as group relief that allow for current trading losses of a surrendering company to be set off. What that looks like, claims for group relief, the kind of losses that can be surrendered. I think I've already outlined, Mr. President, that these are all part of the computation of how the Pillar 2 and the corporation, the minimum tax, the GMT, is calculated. And then finally, in the Income Tax Act, Mr. President, it speaks about things like the prepayment of corporation tax, and I did give an earlier amount that last year we had $470 million collected in corporation tax, 400 of which came from what we used to call, we no longer call IBCs. So, Mr. President, there are a series of schedules as well, how you're calculating the method of the calculation of the accounting period. And all of those elements are covered in the amendments being proposed, including in the administrative directions and guidelines of order number 5. These are the two amendments that are before this honorable chamber. In summary, Mr. President, we have the implementation of the domestic minimum top-up tax, the implementation of the minimum tax rate for Barbados, how they are calculated. We have the implementation, therefore, of the authorized registered small businesses, and it also allows for us to eliminate a series of measures that are currently in force and to replace them with new measures. Mr. President, these are not amendments and these are not reforms that have been undertaken in a vacuum. As I bring my presentation to a close, I want to speak about the process of consultation that has been undertaken to allow us to get to this point. Mr. President, the process of consultation was long, and in some instances, I'm sure the RC will say that it was painful. The team met with and engaged with all of the companies that were in scope to be able to get their sense of, we want to stay in Barbados. If you were to stay in Barbados, what would it require? What would we need to do? How would we need to make some of these reforms? And so, honestly, there were some things that were recommended by some of the companies that were determined by both the government, and in some instances, we also would have engaged with our external partners that could not be accommodated, but we have submitted what now is a comprehensive suite of reforms that allow us to implement the reforms of the corporation tax regime. The expectation, Mr. President, is that not just the BRA and the work that they're doing and the Ministry of Finance, but that the ancillary agencies that work to, one, attract business to Barbados will have to make changes. In the UK, for example, Mr. President, the UK has a provision that is included in their legislation on a redomicile regime, which allows for them to attract businesses that they believe have moved overseas and to bring them back into the UK jurisdiction. You have other jurisdictions that are looking to see what that looks like. The United Arab Emirates was one of the first movers along with Singapore. They moved very quickly, and Switzerland. Switzerland moved very early in the game as well. They actually had a national referendum because, as we know, they are an international banking hub in the world. And so they went to national referendum to be able to look at what they were going to do on these changes. In this instance, Mr. President, with 185 MNEs in scope, Barbados went to have an engagement with all of them. In addition, Mr. President, Barbados also engaged at the level of the Prime Minister of the country and as the Minister of Finance, no less, with the principal companies, principal entities in their home countries. And so as a consequence, Barbados met in Canada and in the UK with the companies that had domicile here in Barbados to engage on what the implications were of these changes, what their concerns were, what their constraints were, and most importantly, what they were likely to do in terms of remaining in Barbados or going to a different jurisdiction in where they originated. All of that consultative work was undertaken. At the institutional level, Mr. President, the Barbados Bar Association, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados, the Barbados International Business Association, the Association for Global Business, and the Barbados Chamber of Commerce, where applicable, all had the benefit of consultations and were part of the process of engagement, Mr. President, because 185 MNEs with a scope of 850 USD, 750 euros, and 1.6 billion Barbados dollars had to be consulted with because that is nothing to sniff at. And I want to close with this, Mr. President, because I said it during my presentation, but it is worthwhile repeating. A government does not trade. A government has no money of its own to trade with. Every single social service that this country benefits from has to come from somewhere, and it comes from taxes. And a government will not take lightly $470 million in corporation tax. It simply will not. It will make sure that it makes the best possible decision with the best possible expertise, with persons who are immersed and embedded in global tax reform and global tax policy and the calculation of taxes based on the OECD system and the implementation of the two-pillar approach. Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 2 in particular with the introduction of a global minimum tax set at 15% for countries around the world, with countries having to make a determination as to whether or not they were going to come in at the full 15 or any part thereof. And if they came in as a part thereof, the top-up would be applicable in the other jurisdiction. These are the two matters, Mr. President, that are before the Honorable Chamber. I understand that they are local and global all at once, but I hope that I have gone into sufficient detail and I've kept it sufficiently simple that honorable members would have an appreciation of the sheer scale of what we are dealing with. And I want to commend this bill to this honorable chamber, and as I do so, I want to express my appreciation in closing to all of the partners, including the BRA who is present here today, for the work that they have done to get us to this stage. I beg to move, Mr. President, that this bill not be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummins. Senator Watson.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning to the members of the chamber. I also want to recognize our guest today, Mr. President, Senator Hines. Some folk may say we would no longer call Senator Hines Senator Hines. I am one of those people who's on the belief that having held such an office, you continue to carry that title, and that you should. I also want to welcome Senator Hines back. I also want to welcome the staff from the Barbados Revenue Authority, the Commissioner and her staff who are present with us today, and the specially invited guest of Senator Thompson. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Mr. President, once again, this BRP administration is passing legislation in an effort to be a first mover, we're told. And the bills will pass. But I see a need to drill down so that the people who will be affected by the new legislation know what we are going to face. And it's not just multinationals with tremendous income, but every single business in Barbados is going to be affected by the legislation that is before us today. And we need to know not just the benefits, but also the burdens that this legislation will attract. And once again, we, the Democratic Labour Party opposition, find ourselves having to address the devil that is in the details. What details am I talking about, Mr. President? In the past 2 weeks, everyone in Barbados must be aware that taxpayers have been receiving notifications from our tax administrator, which they regard as, I think, they feel threatened. They're being asked to file outstanding returns, and of course, they're being told that they may owe penalties for late filing and interest on any taxes that are due because of these outstanding returns. And some of these people actually aren't tax resident in Barbados. Some of them don't have jobs. Some of them are students who may have done some short stint and have gone back to school, so they're not currently employed. And some don't even meet the tax threshold, so they're under that $25,000. And accountants in Barbados will tell you that they are inundated with queries from their clients as to how they will contend with notices that they have received. Some who have deregistered are receiving notices or in the process of deregistering, for example, in respect of VAT registration, have also received notices about outstanding returns. And they're concerned. Now, I need to, I think, ask the members on the other side to ask of the Minister of Finance some questions for the people of Barbados. One, we need to understand what would provoke that broad communication to people who are actually not expecting that they will have to pay taxes and file returns across this landscape. But we also know that we are having pensioners, for example, ask questions about why they find that they have to pay taxes on their pension income. They're fixed income earners, use the term earners loosely as far as they're concerned, because they don't think they're earning anything because they're not employed and they don't intend to go back to employment. Inflation remains high, and that is something that has been acknowledged by the Central Bank of Barbados, so they don't see why they should be having to pay taxes on their pensions. And they also don't see why they're being asked to file returns, because that is a burden on a lot of senior citizens in Barbados, whether they have to get up and go down to a tax clinic and have a return filled out, or they have to rely on somebody else to fill out a return, or have to navigate the online system themselves. So they are asking, why do they continue to have to do this? I think that is a valid question, and I'm putting it here today. I think an amnesty can be given in relation to all of those notifications that have been sent out as well. I think an amnesty would work for everyone. Those who have received those notices, the people who have to administer, because I can only imagine that the Barbados Revenue Authority is also inundated with the queries coming out of those notifications, and they would like to be unburdened from having to deal with them. I'm told that it is perhaps an automatic thing coming out of the platform, and I'll talk about the TAMIS platform a little bit later. With this occurring, Mr. President, we are concerned that we are looking at additional administration requirements coming out of the new legislation that we're looking at, the Corporation Top-Up Tax Bill and the Income Tax Amendment Bill. Because when you look at how these taxes have to be administered, that's additional responsibility for the Barbados Revenue Authority. And it's not the fault of the staff of the authority. There are also takers of this legislation. The question is whether they will be sufficiently resourced to be able to handle what is being placed before them. Now, let me digress a little here, Mr. President. Senator Cummings has confirmed that Barbados indeed has on its payroll a consultant out of the OECD. In fact, I'm told that there's more than one consultant. And I think it is important for us to understand if there are the actual architects of the legislation, not just advisors, but whether we are taking something that has been handed to us. And when I look at the details in the legislation, I am certainly of the opinion that we are taking something that has been handed to us. And I'll tell you why. I'll come back to it a little bit later as well. That is in relation to the rules that are being embedded in the legislation. And I think that we have to be exceedingly circumspect about what we pass as laws in this country. When we say we have gotten advice from an international consultant, you've heard me on this before, that's certainly not impressive to me. What is impressive is if when we take advice, we make what we do fit for purpose, for our circumstances, and not just take recommendations wholesale and foist them on the country of Barbados, the people who have to implement, the people who have to utilize the legislation, and the people who have to utilize the legislation are the citizens of Barbados. In this particular case, it will particularly be companies in Barbados, but there are also others who will have to utilize this legislation, because you will have individuals who file as businesses, so the self-employed, you will have small business owners, you will have large business, medium-sized business owners, you will have the practitioners who have to advise their clients, and of course, you have the people who have to administer the legislation. The legislation has to make sense. What we are seeing, Mr. President, we believe, is going to result in more red tape. This is the thing that strangles business development in Barbados. And the filing requirements in these two bills will be a challenge, ironically, to our international competitiveness, coupled with an increased tax rate, because that, in effect, is what it is. And only time will tell if we will attract or retain international business coming out of these changes. So we understand the need to demonstrate to the world that we are not a tax haven, and it is exceedingly important that the Barbados government continues to have that conversation, to tell our story. We've been telling it, to continue to have that conversation in the corridors of power globally. But we also have to ensure that in an effort to demonstrate that we are not a tax haven, we do not burden our international business sector or our other business sectors to such an extent that other investment is choked. Now, I'm told by experts in our international business sector that, like any other business, considerations of the bottom line could actually see businesses moving away. And indeed, Senator Cummings referred to that possibility. They will move to our competitors, potentially in the region, for example, who have not implemented this regime. But of course, we're a first mover. And we will no doubt suffer the consequences of being first mover. And one of the things that will be important to attracting and retaining new business as well, Mr. President, will be clear and predictable regulation, including in relation to revenue collection and administration. And what is also important is that we have easy pathways to doing business in Barbados. And despite all of the talk about it, business facilitation in Barbados, the ease of doing business, has not shown any appreciable improvements. People who are out there doing business every day complain about interacting with our primary business regulators. The lack of speed, the backlogs that we're contending with, the introduction of new requirements that also place a burden, actually, on those regulatory agencies. So, Corporate Affairs and Intellectual Property Office, our banking system, Barbados Revenue Authority, our judicial system, the lack of an effective commercial mediation and alternative dispute resolution system, a developed one, because many of us have trained, but we have not developed those mechanisms to make it easy for businesses to resolve conflicts that may occur between them. And of course, we like to brag about being out front, being first, and providing global leadership. But I noticed that in saying those things, patting ourselves on the back in relation to adopting this OECD regime, just this week, I saw in an article in the Daily Nations Business Authority this week or last week, a comment from the head of a UK-based advocacy group on Tax Justice Network, that Barbados' best bet for a fairer international tax system is the United Nations, not measures including the quote-unquote poorly designed global minimum tax being led by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That was very interesting, Mr. President, because that is the regime that we are adopting. And I think that the government has to explain to us how that lines up with the fact that we actually are also engaged with that, the development of that UN system, or at least we've accepted that that's the route that we should go. And the question, therefore, is, have we rushed ahead? Is the government rushing in? They won't call us fools. Rushing in where angels fear to tread. Because when we look at the countries that have come on board, there are many countries that actually have not taken on the top-up regime, and many countries that have deferred aspects of the OECD regime. So we hear everybody's doing it, but that's actually not correct. Many people are not doing it and not taking the lengths that we are taking. Mr. President, in the other place we heard that this bill will help with resilience and sustainability and achieving SDGs, among other things. Frankly, that sounded somewhat nonsensical to me. I didn't see it. I didn't see how. And we collect revenue for a lot of things. We accept that. But to keep tossing around the words resilience and sustainability and the abbreviation SDG to, I suppose, try to impress that we're functioning at this global level. Everything we do falls within that context. It really is completely unimpressive. And I think the members on the government side ought to realize by now that Barbadians don't want to hear that stuff anymore. They're concerned about what they're feeling on the ground, what they have to contend with as they go about their daily lives every day in this country. And they don't want to hear resilience, and don't want to hear sustainability, they don't want to hear SDGs if they are not feeling it as they move around and do business, as they are looking at what they have in their pockets. And so we do not nod in agreement. If the government thinks that we do, every time they utter those words, the government would be wrong. These buzzwords are not impressing business people in Barbados that now have to take on the additional administrative burdens and costs that they will have to take on in an effort to comply with these two new laws that the government is seeking to put in place today. Mr. President, owners and operators of businesses who haven't paid close attention to these bills will need to know that, for example, in the Income Tax Amendment Bill, there's a requirement that starting 2025, every company must pay a prepayment of corporation tax monthly, Mr. President, monthly to the government of Barbados, based on taxable income in the preceding year. And it happens now, but not on that regularity. And imagine the shock, particularly of small business people, because big business people like Senator Malalu over here, who have finance departments that can take this on, will find that to be easier. But small businesses will find it to be difficult, whether they have to do that administration themselves, Senator Malalu protests, whether they have to do that themselves, or they have to pay somebody to do it for them. That's an administrative burden. That is an additional cost. So while the government takes care of its cash flow issues, small businesses will find themselves facing cash flow issues as well coming out of this monthly prepayment requirement. I think it's ill-advised. I think that we will find that businesses that would normally, or new businesses that would normally be eager to be compliant, will find themselves in a spot of bother trying to keep up compliance. And those of us who have paid, who have been VAT registrants, who know how difficult it is to do the bi-monthly filing and payments, will understand what I'm talking about. Those who haven't might think it's just a thing. But that has been problematic. I think we all know it has been problematic from the time that that requirement was put in place. We still amble along with it, but that is the constant complaint of businesses in Barbados. And I think it has been a complaint also for the Tax Collection Authority because they have to administer those returns and those payments as well. And all of us here, well, Senator Tate is not here today, but Senator Maynard, Senator Malalou, myself, Senator Walters, Senator Nichols, all of us who are involved in business have to know. In our gut, but also cognitively, because we're doing this, we know that this is going to be a challenge. And when the government says that it consulted, well, of course, it can't come into every business and consult, but I take note that the consultation is at the level of the big boys. They're always the ones who are consulted. And many small entities do not get the opportunity to have a say in measures of this nature. So, for example, Mr. President, we have found ways to consult broadly with society on key issues that will affect them daily. We don't expect consultation on everything. However, when we get a situation like this, we hear about the stakeholders who are consulted, and the stakeholders who are consulted are not the majority. They may be the majority of the money, but they are not the majority of the operators. But every last one of us will have to contend with monthly payments, and I'm going to assume filings, because I'll file something along with the payment, not just send along some money, every month, while we are also trying to run our businesses and to keep our costs and our administrative requirements down to a minimum. And I think this is ill-advised. I think the cabinet ought to rethink this. Mr. President, I'm surprised, perhaps they ask you for your advice. You have considerable experience in these matters, and if they didn't, that is our loss. But I beg the Cabinet of Barbados to talk to the people who have to do this work every day, not just on the government side, because the people on the government side are essentially, they're going to try to work with what the government passes. But those of us who have to fulfill the requirement, some consideration has to be given to small businesses in that respect. I don't want to call them sole practitioners, self-employed people who file as businesses, we're going to be subject to it too. I know because I file as a business. And therefore, I would ask the government to relook this requirement and perhaps stick to what it has right now, which is the quarterly filing, which would be much less of a burden on businesses and on the Barbados Revenue Authority. Now, Mr. President, the buzzwords that I mentioned earlier will not help us with processing these payments. And in addition to the cash flow issues that it will no doubt present, it may well present an additional burden in respect of the platform that we have to interact with for filing and paying our taxes. And one of the things that also I think would be problematic is a continuing problem that has been cited by the Auditor General of Barbados, and that is the reconciliation of the receipts that go into the Consolidated Fund versus what people have said, because I'm going to have to put it that way. They have paid into the Barbados, and they think they're paying into the Barbados Revenue Authority, they're paying into the Consolidated Fund, and the issues that continue to exist in relation to reconciliation. So there are taxpayers who can tell you that money has left their bank account in payment of taxes, but the Barbados Revenue Authority cannot say that they have received or they can find that money. And that is a reconciliation issue, Mr. President. The problem there is that that means that the taxpayer is now seen as delinquent, and subject to penalties and interest if they cannot demonstrate that they have made that payment. That is another burden on businesses who are suffering from that particular situation, and it has to be fixed. I believe the fix, $1.8 billion, Mr. President, in receivables. And among those receivables will be some money that actually has been paid according to taxpayers who can say money has left their bank account. So we're talking about direct transfers. And some experts are of the opinion that tax revenues should be collected directly by the Barbados Revenue Authority. I would say, in particular, corporation tax. And by that, I mean pay to BRA. BRA then is responsible for, well, reconciliation, but it's not reconciling between itself and another agency. It's reconciling against the accounts of taxpayers. That obviously would solve a problem that clearly is persisting. And I would be surprised if Barbados Revenue Authority did not agree with me on this, that they should manage the collection of those tax revenues so that they can at least get ahead of that issue that they're continuing to confront in relation to reconciling between themselves and the Treasury Department. That's an issue that we have to get on top of as a country. Now, one also has to ask about the issue of implementation. Have the resources been provided to the Barbados Revenue Authority? Both the people resources, because if you're doing more process management, there should be more bodies to deal with the process management. Do they have the appropriate technological resources, Mr. President? But it's not just the Barbados Revenue Authority. I am told by the practitioners, and I certainly know as an attorney, and there will be accountants, corporate finance advisors, people who are advising boards and management teams on the governance and the operational management of their companies. We need to know. But in particular, those people who are going to, again, be interacting with the Barbados Revenue Authority, particularly the accounting field in Barbados, they too have signaled that they need to upskill. And it isn't to be scoffed at, because when you look at the rules that we're talking about implementing here, it's not just the bill, which in itself is complex, very complex actually, and quite long. So you have to read it and you have to understand it. But then we are asked to cross-refer to some additional rules that do not emerge from this jurisdiction. So that means that the Barbados Revenue Authority staff and the practitioners in Barbados have to understand as a working tool, not just a book that they're going to look at, read a few pages and, set it aside, as a working tool, how these laws, in particular the top-up tax law, but also the income tax amendment law, because it has a credit system in there, and so they need to understand how that works for the benefit of their clients. Now, speaking of practitioners and dealing with the administration of this law, Mr. President, let me give what I think is a major example. Clause 2.2 of the Corporation Top-Up Tax Bill states, and I'm going to quote, "This act shall be construed in a manner that generates outcomes that are consistent or functionally equivalent with the Globe Model Rules, supplemented by the Pillar 2 commentary and any agreed administrative guidance on the interpretation or the administration of the Globe Model Rules issued by the Inclusive Framework on Base Erosion and Profit Shifting." Senator Cummings spoke extensively, Mr. President, about these rules. But the rules are just that. They are rules made by a club, the OECD. And the Pillar 2 commentary are notes to those rules. And then there's any administrative guidance. Well, those words speak for themselves. Again, just a club's rules, which means, Mr. President, that we don't own and control those rules. I, as an attorney, as a person who has trained in drafting, I am flabbergasted to see that my sovereign government is incorporating the rules of a club over whom Barbados has no control. and of which Barbados is not a member, and therefore actually has no influence. We could go talk to them, maybe beg a little bit, but we can't influence them. We can't tell them what to do. We are incorporating their rules into the laws of our republic. And because those rules are controlled by that club could change those rules without any reference to us, which means that our law, this corporation top-up tax law, can change. And we don't even know. And we have no control. Our legislature will not have changed our law. A foreign club would have changed our law. And then we will say to businesses and the tax administration authority, you have to comply because that's what our law says. The act has to be construed in accordance with rules that we have no legislative or policy control over. That is a setup for constant moving of the goalposts, which the OECD has done in relation to our tax status, whether we are viewed as a haven. We continue to complain, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why we're trying to implement this today, complain about how they have treated us, constantly moving the goalposts, regardless of what we do. And here now we have incorporated, or are going to incorporate, into our statutes, a goalpost moving regime. How fascinating. But it is chilling, because we who are practicing will constantly have to go and find the most recent version, interpret the most recent version. We may not have been consulted on the most recent version of the rules. And Mr. President, if you go, so you cannot read this law and not go and find those rules. The rules and the Pillar 2 commentary and any administrative guidelines, you would have to be using those together and hope that you are using the most recent iteration of those rules. That's just a warning. We're going to pass it as it is. I expect the government has the numbers. But this is important stuff for people who are dealing with it every single day, because it also means that the staff of the Barbados Revenue Authority themselves have to constantly be vigilant about what rules they are supposed to apply in interpreting this legislation. It's nothing to scoff at. It's actually a pretty important principle, because we want laws to be clear. There should be some certainty in how they are applied. Yes, they can change, but there also has to be a process predictable for that change, whether by regulations or amendment to the parent statute. So that is something that needs to be flagged. The government of Barbados needs to look at that. We need to guard our sovereignty when it comes to our legislative process and not incorporate, because we can incorporate a treaty, Mr. President, but we make the treaty or aspects of the treaty our law. We don't say, and then maybe somebody else over there can do something else with it, and we will comply with it. We have to know what it is we're required to comply with. So I will move ahead from that point, but we have to guard our sovereignty jealously. And I think we're making an error when we allow the embedding in legislation of rules that don't have treaty status, and that we are not required to agree with for them to come into place. Now, Mr. President, as far as the practicality of dealing with the administration of these new taxation requirements, portals established for doing government business, Mr. President, must work. We seem to take the path of least resistance when we implement technological tools for doing government business in Barbados. Those of us who make contact with them regularly are frustrated a lot of the time. When we come, you click on a menu, it drops down, you click on something else, and then nothing. So it appears to have all of this functionality, but then a lot of the functionality is missing. And we have to, particularly if we're going to implement complex systems like we're contemplating with our tax regimes, we have to ensure that we make it easier for the affected parties, the taxpayers, whether businesses or individuals, to interact with the government when we're doing business with it. We know, we hear that we are digitizing, but we're talking about systems that exist at this moment. KIPO, new and improved portal. Very limited things you can do on it. All of the people, service providers, who have to interact with it are disappointed. We thought it would be easier to do business with KIPO online. And many of us are having to resort to the old, I don't know, it's probably based on DOS system, to do a lot of our online business. And now we're told that we cannot make payments to our accounts at KIPO as agents using EasyPay, which you used to be able to do. I don't understand how that could go backward. And you can't make payments directly to KIPO on KIPO's website in the same way as you can do that. Well, I don't know, the payment doesn't go to Barbados Revenue Authority, I don't believe, but you can go from Barbados Revenue Authority website, on that website, and process a payment. And that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense if we're having a complicated business regulation and tax regulation regime, but it is hard for us to do the things that we actually want to do, because if we didn't want to pay our taxes, we won't go on Thomas and try to talk to Brad. And in that respect, I also want to talk about how the absence of functionality makes it hard for the government to collect taxes. So for example, and I see this in my practice, clients who may have in particular land tax arrears, who want to take up the payment plan, save themselves on some penalty and interest. There is the appearance of a function that will allow you to do that on the land tax portal. But when you try and fill in all your details, nothing happens. Then you have to go and use the analog mechanism to ask the minister to allow you that facility. And I'm told that can take upwards of 6 months. Mr. President, that is versus being able to do something directly online on a portal that suggests it has that functionality, have AI tools determine whether the applicant qualifies, and let the person just pay. I have clients who would want to just pay, but they have to pause and hope that they get the approval. And the approval is subjective also, because we actually do not know what is considered for the minister to say, yes, Senator Walters can get it. No, I'm not going to pick on you, Senator Malalu. No, Senator Nichols cannot get it. That also should be clear. It should be objective. And I believe it should be in the hands of the Revenue Commissioner. I do not think it has to go to the level of the minister. You want to collect the revenue, somebody says, I want to pay you, I would think that you would want to take the money as fast as possible. I expect that we will hear, well, no, we have heard that there was much consultation, Mr. President. Again, I will say consultation must not be performative. So it is not enough to say we want to do this. Hear what the stakeholders, people who are affected, say about not necessarily if, but how it ought to be done, and then you ignore it and forge ahead. A lot of suggestions made in consultations are very practical, and the government needs to consult in good faith, not to say they did it, but with the intention of taking the knowledge on board, because Barbadians are losing faith with the government when it says it is going to consult, if it looks like it is just doing that as a performative activity, Mr. President. That's all that I will say on that. Now, it's not just the international and big businesses that will be affected by new tax rates. We all will be, unless we can apply under the Small Business Development Act. And again, that is a process issue, Mr. President. It is conventional wisdom out there that the process takes too long, so it's not an efficient process, but also there are too many moving parts to it. Things that could be positively impacted from an application and processing perspective if there is a single window. If the government has your information already, it can access NIS, it can say whether, because it issues compliance certificates, you shouldn't have to go and get a compliance certificate to apply to the government to see if you're compliant. So all of these are processes that we have to eliminate the extra steps, Mr. President, so as to make it easier for businesses to take advantage of things that the government will offer. The opportunity to take advantage as a small business under the Small Business Development Act is a good thing, but many small businesses do not want to go through that process, Mr. President, because it is too difficult. And a small business, by its very nature, cannot take on the additional administrative burden. It cannot take on the cost, Mr. President. So we have to find ways to make it easier for businesses, small businesses in particular, to be facilitated. We happily facilitate big business. We have to extend the same grace, the same courtesies to the people who need it most to survive. They may not be able to come and say that they've put $100 million in investment in Barbados, but they employ people, spend money, feed their families, etc., etc., etc. They're important to our business landscape, and we have to facilitate them by making it easy to do business with government. Also, our tax regime is about to become more complicated. But we actually should be trying to simplify it. And we've heard from 2018 that we're going to have tax reform. And what we have seen is tax complication. That's a form of reform, Mr. President, of course it is. But that's not what we were looking for. We have to be able to get it done easier, not build additional taxes, additional concession mechanisms on top of all of what has existed, and then everybody has to try to find a way through what is essentially a quagmire. Again, that brings administrative burden and it brings costs, in particular to small enterprises. I am told, but I've already said, we have to be careful not to drive businesses that want to participate, who want to come above ground. We have to be careful not to drive them underground, and we have to make sure that what we do brings those who are starting above ground from the start, so that they like Bajans, we tend to be compliant, we tend to be law-abiding, and a lot of businesses want to be law-abiding. When, during the period of COVID, even on my visits to Kaipo, because I have a tendency to get up and go into Kaipo and do business directly from time to time, and there were a great number of Barbadians registering businesses under the Business Names Act. Those businesses then will say to BRA, I am a business, I want to file as a business, I want to take all the advantage of, if I have losses, if there are credits, etc., etc. Quite a lot. I mean, I expect that if you ask BRA, they would tell you that there was a bump in their business name registrations at that time. So we know that businesses, a lot of people who are running businesses in Barbados want to do things the right way. But if we make it too hard and too expensive, there's too much to navigate, they are going to be driven underground. That will have the direct and deleterious impact of limiting the revenue that we can collect. So that when we are looking at all of these measures, we have to put all of these considerations in the pot when we decide not just what we're going to do, but how we are going to do it. We have to consider the law of unintended consequences, cause that, Mr. President, and make a pragmatic determination. Mr. President, there's some positives in the legislation. So there are the credits, jobs credit, the research and development credit. When I heard of the jobs credit, I was excited. It sounded interesting to me. I don't have 50 employees, so I can't ask for it. But there are businesses that want to grow. That can also be an impetus for growing or maintaining employment levels. And so I was intrigued, but on reading the bill, it became clear to me that businesses need to understand that this actually is a very limited application. So it applies only to those businesses that carry on in a particular income year business in financial technology, provided that it is the principal business of the company, and wholesale trade, or it'll have to be or, wholesale trade and distribution of goods without physical inventory or storage in the state being Barbados. That's quite limited. So businesses need to understand that, and they need to understand how the credit will be applied. So what does the law say? In the first instance, there's an offset. I don't think that's a bad idea. We do offsets in taxation administration in Barbados. So first, against national insurance contributions, corporation tax payable, value-added tax payable. And surplus will be refunded in cash or cash equivalent, or in bonds, or debenture, or other long-term or short-term government debt instruments, and any surplus, cash or cash equivalent. Businesses need to understand that. So when, everybody gets excited and starts to salivate, they need to understand that there are limitations. They need to talk to their tax advisors. The tax advisors need to read the legislation carefully and not depress the legislation, and understand what the limitations are and how the credits will be applied. Similarly, there's the research and development credit, and that too is commendable. We want to see more research and development occurring in the country. And Mr. President, it makes me think of my MBA dissertation, which looks at entrepreneurship in Barbados, the blockages to entrepreneurship, and the things that the government ought to do, government policies that ought to be adopted to encourage entrepreneurship. And one of the big things in other countries is research and development. Research and development initiatives, intellectual property owned by the development institution, normally an academic institution, but done with funding from the private sector. The academic institution then monetizes, and we see that coming out of other jurisdictions, monetizes the research and development output, and that is a loop, continues. And I think that is something that we need to focus on here in Barbados some more. There can be credits to investors who will, in an agreement with an academic institution, work on research and development programs, particularly in the STEAM arena, but there are other things that we can be doing if we think that they are exportable in particular, Mr. President. And by exportable, we don't necessarily mean widgets. We mean any good or service that can be exportable. And it is something that I would suggest that the government spend some time and effort on to look at how we can incentivize that kind of paradigm where an academic institution directly links with investors, and there are benefits to both entities, and there may actually be an individual in there who produces the intellectual property, and that all of those parties can benefit, and the government of Barbados benefit, because obviously when we export, that's revenue for us as well. Finally, Mr. President, we practitioners find ourselves having to work with disparate laws. In particular, the company laws. There have been many amendments in recent times, and now we know that we are dealing with quite a few amendments to the revenue legislation. Lawyers and accountants will tell you they're everywhere. Sometimes we don't even know they exist, and I've gone over it before. When we go and try to find them in the official gazette, we can't say in because there's no physical copy. When you try to navigate the website, it's like pulling teeth from a hen. Mr. President. That needs to be sorted. However, we have a law revision body, and that body's responsibility is to also look at consolidating statutes. What I'm asking for is that we have consolidated companies statutes and consolidated revenue statutes so that we're not butting about the place. In fact, the judges are having a challenge with it also, Mr. President. So we need to do something about that so that when we sit down to do our work, we can be compliant with the most up-to-date laws. We know where to find them. We can utilize them. We can advise our clients, and businesses can advise themselves. They know what they're working with because laws are essentially your operating tools. We treat them as though there are these high-level terms that only a few can understand and deal with. That's not the way laws are supposed to work. Those of us who use them, I'm not talking about lawyers, I'm talking about the citizenry, need to be able to utilize them. And the people who use them in doing business need to be able to use them as their tools. We need to be able to find them, Mr. President. I am going to ask the members on the other side to appeal to the Attorney General to impress upon him the urgent need to have consolidated company statutes, consolidated revenue statutes. In the same way as we have consolidated the Constitution, that is available to find in one place the amendments that were made, in particular the amendments to move us to a republic. This is important for us to be able to just do our jobs from day to day. Mr. President, those are my comments on the bills that are before us. I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Senator Watson. Senator Maladu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning to everyone. Mr. President, like you, I would like to start off by welcoming our guest, one I met for the first time today. But I want to say a special welcome to Chrissy. I don't know why you forsake me, but anyhow, you left me. And of course, to the members of the BRA, my good friend, Louisa. So, Mr. President, I want to have a few words. As you know, as usual, I am brief and to the point. So, with regards to these bills, I want to start out by congratulating the full BRA team and all that supported them, and Senator Cummins and all of her team as well. It is very difficult. I don't really work in the international business sector, but I have a lot of clients who are there, and it seems to me that the conditions, the goalposts, everything has changed against us over and over again. And at the end of the day, in this matter, we have to take what is given to us. We are not the architects of our fate in that regard. We can be the architects in other areas, but in this area, we are not. I really only have one comment about specifically something in this, in CAP 73. As I said earlier, it's a very technical. Frankly speaking, I trust the RA team and all the advisors on it, and I'm not going to delve into all of this tier 2 or pillar 2 and pillar 1 and etc. It's not an area that I practice in, and there are lots of people a lot more knowledgeable than me who have done so. I would, though, like to take a look at Article 43, Clause 9A, which is the one which basically allows us to take our small businesses out of this 9% regime and possibly even 15% global minimum tax regime and keep a preferential tax rate for small businesses in Barbados. And I'm supportive of the clause, but it's interesting that the reason I mention it here is that in this particular act, Mr. President, there's an additional criteria that has been added, which I understand why, which the additional criteria now has been added is that your income must be under $2 million. So basically what we're saying is a small business who otherwise qualifies under, I think it is CAP 318C, and has less than $2 million in income can get the reduced tax rate. Again, that is a good thing, sir. I appreciate the government for making sure that we kept that rate. Thank you. It seems that I do represent some small businesses and not just the big ones, it seems. At least some people think so. For once, apparently, for once. I'm also understood, and I'm subject to correction, Mr. President, that there are some 8,000 companies in Barbados that would qualify under there. I'm sure that if I have misspoken, I will be corrected by those in the room later on. And I'm happy to hear what that number is. Sir, in Cap 318C, so let me just go back to the amendment that we're looking at now, Clause 43, as I mentioned, Clause 9, the new Clause 9, says that our small businesses, which are eligible under 318C, sir, and here I will divulge for a moment, sir, and agree with Senator Watson that in trying to read this bill, it is another example where not having all the legislation, all the amendments that have been made over the years in one place makes our job extremely difficult. I personally found 4 different amendments that I had to read and try to incorporate into the principal bill before I could really understand what is here. This needs to be fixed urgently, sir, if we are going to speak in here in an informed way and not make mistakes. Leaving it the way it is, we are going to make mistakes, not just the judges, but in the legislature as well, when we don't see all of these things. So I want to support Senator Watson in her comments on that, a comments I've made previously. However, let's go back then to this 318C, and I'm going to make my point on this. 318C sets out for us in Clause 4, I think it is Clause 3, excuse me, sets out the criteria to determine you must meet 2 criteria of the 3. You must have, to be a small business, you've got to have capital under $1 million, sales under $2 million, or 25 employees or less. So any 2 of those 3 will allow you in that very objective measure to say that you're a small business. There are some other measures which are a bit more complicated, but they're very clear. But the 4th paragraph, sir, of that piece of legislation troubles me. The 4th paragraph, B, paragraph 4B, basically says that the minister has the right to determine if your business is significant or substantial. I don't understand, sir, where this criteria came from. Why, having met all of these other objective criteria, we then have this very subjective criteria that is left there that, in fact, I would have to describe it as arbitrary. Because if you are a individual, one person getting one job in one family, that is substantial. Perhaps to IBM Computer, one job for one person is not substantial. But in the context of Barbados, in the context of a small business, just one job is substantial. I don't need any criteria for that. And I don't understand what is significant. I do not understand why this clause is left in there. But I don't want to dwell too much on it because I want to dwell on the principle. The principle continues to be, and you will hear me, sir, you've heard me many times in here speak to this. Certainty is what businesses want. And introducing this criteria, which none of us can understand exactly why it would be, that some individual, maybe a very reasonable person, gets to come through all of these other objective criteria, everything that the law is meant to do, and it comes right to the end and it says, is it significant or substantial socio-economic activity? And with that decision that one individual can make, you are no longer registered as a small business in Barbados. That creates uncertainty. It's perhaps using Barbados parlance, it might be unfair, but the word I will use is arbitrary. And arbitrary in this sense is it's random choice, or perhaps it is personal whim that gets to choose that. So, sir, you know, the last time I spoke in here, I introduced the letters C and F. I now give you A. A for arbitrary. I don't like arbitrary when it comes to our legislation either. I think government should fix this. I think it's a great opportunity to go back and revisit 318C, I think it is, and I think that clause should be removed completely. If you meet the objective criteria, there should be certainty around being registered as a small business. The other thing I would just mention on there is that it would have been the definition of small business. I would have liked to have seen it expanded, and could we have perhaps included, rather than just $2 million, could it have been $3 or $4 or $5 million? Maybe $10 million could have been the threshold. And maybe rather than 25 employees, could it have been a little bit bigger? How far could we have pushed this envelope so as to keep that low tax rate for our young businesses, our small businesses, to keep that lower tax rate without going offside with the international community? I don't know, but that would be something I would ask you to consider. Sir, my last point, and as you know, as I said earlier, I always try to be brief, but whenever I look at this and I see these type of arbitrary things, and I see what I've described as frustration instead of facilitation, I'm also concerned about something else that's happening that's related to this, and it's a small matter right now, but somewhat related to the BRA. I personally believe that Barbadians on the whole, all of us, we want to have a meaningful job, and we want to do something that counts. I believe that we want to do meaningful work. I believe that we all want to contribute to Barbados' development. But sir, there continues to be things in our economy, things that we do, regulations that I do not understand. And it only creates more frustration. And as I have said and made a clear point before, frustration leads to that C word, remember? That's what it leads to, a problem. Sir, today, when you license a vehicle, you know, one of my favorite subjects, when we license a vehicle, you pay a fee. You do not need to pay any more fee ever again on that vehicle, because the licensing is included in the tax you pay on the petrol, sir. And it was said that what we would do is that we have a problem in Barbados because the insurance companies report that 20 to 25% of all the vehicles on Barbadian roads, sir, are uninsured. Now, how do they get that statistic? They get the statistic because they know of the accidents, sir. So they know how many accidents, they know how many cars, and they know in those cases how many cars involved in an accident are uninsured. Now, it may be true that it is skewed, and Senator Boyce might correct me and say that those who are uninsured are the reckless drivers, so they're more often in accidents. That might be true, but statistically, the reality is 20 to 25% of all vehicles on the road are uninsured. So this system that we have today, where, and let me explain how it works, on an annual basis, you are required to take your insurance certificate, go to the Barbados Revenue Authority licensing office, show them that, to say that you have, yes, it's still required, unfortunately. You know what, most of us don't do it, sir, as I see you shaking your head. Most of us don't do it, because what we understood was going to happen was that the insurance companies were going to electronically correspond, and we would know who was on the road. But I am advised by the car dealership group that that is in fact not the practice, that you have to go and get it. Now, I don't know exactly what, maybe I'm misinformed, sir, but I did some interesting little numbers on this. I am told that we have 130,000 vehicles on the road, sir. There are 365 days in a year most often. Of those, given some holidays and weekends, there are 250 working days. That means that in Barbados, 520 cars per day have to go through this process. 520 cars. When I add up the hours of opening at the various offices to license these cars, I got 18 hours per day. That means that we have to do 29 vehicles per hour to be relicensed. I put this all, sir, within the context of the frustration, the facilitation, and that Barbadians want to do useful work. If you think that on average a car takes an hour to be relicensed, that's 130 hours, 30,000 hours per year that we are wasting. So I don't want to dwell on this, sir, because this is a bigger bill and it has a much bigger ramifications, and I've made my point about the small business. But I wanted to use this to illustrate to you, sir, my continued challenge to government to drive out from the processes these old ways of doing things. Find new ways, become efficient, because it doesn't matter what tax regime we put in place. If we continue to frustrate businesses at all levels, this will not work. It will not work for us. So I do hope, sir, that I have raised the point, and I may be, I hope I'm not incorrect, but I may have not filled in all the details on each of the points of it. But I hope that I've raised the point again in here, our need for business facilitation, which includes the simple processes that we do every day. With those few words, sir, I support the bill, and I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Malalu. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the suspension of this sitting of the Senate for lunch until 2:20 p.m. 2:45 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be adjourned until 2:45 p.m. today. The honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This sitting is suspended until 2:45 p.m. today.